Wednesday, the 15th of March 2019, and something really cool is happening. It's Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's birthday. She's 330 years old today. Happy birthday. Have one on me, Mary. Cheers. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like it. Okay. Also, something else is happening, or has just happened. Rockstar Games just dropped a big update for Red Dead Redemption 2, and as a nice surprise to celebrate Mary's birthday, they've also included some significant improvements to HDR. So, we have some new manual adjustments for HDR. Exciting stuff. Now, just for a little bit of background, back in October 2018, I wrote an article for Digital Foundry, and it revealed some detail about Red Dead Redemption 2's HDR setup, and it highlighted some things that were not quite as they seemed. Essentially, the game artificially attempted to suggest high dynamic range by only adjusting the game's white point and grey point, brightening the whole image, raising near black, and not being able to actually deal with the apparent dimness. The inclusion of this unnecessary HDR option caused much irritation from image quality enthusiasts and gamers who found that the game looked flat and lifeless when HDR was engaged. I concluded that the way the game looked was perhaps a product of the game chasing a traditional cinematic look, and the SDR version of the game essentially being the default version of the game. Well, this update kind of confirms this, and it goes a long way to address some of the concerns that I had. We're now presented with two HDR modes in-game. The cinematic HDR mode is described as preserving the original artistic direction of the game. You're given an option to adjust paper white between 80 nits, which is the default non-adjusted image, and to be able to stretch that all the way up to 500 nits. But as many noticed, versus playing the game in SDR, the overall kind of gamma setup, contrast and saturation is quite significantly different. If you do want to use this mode, then the closer you are to the untampered value of 80, the less wrong things will be. Now, the new setting is the HDR game mode, which Rockstar have kindly put in to address the tastes of gamers worldwide. First off, the peak brightness has actually been unlocked. Rather than using the same value as paper white and brightening the whole image, this simply allows for bright light sources to exceed the 80 nit limit present in cinematic mode. The great news is that this doesn't appear to be subject to any shenanigans. And believe me when I say I've been looking really hard for evidence of weirdness. Now, there are some guidelines for how to set this. There's a typical peak white logo, and you can use this to try and match it up with your display's EOTF tracking. This is a good place to start, and this will stop the game pushing out data brighter than your display can interpret. Probably wouldn't do you any harm if you went above it, so don't be too concerned. You just may occasionally see some clipping up in the clouds or something, so if you see that, you can always drop it back a little. As for the paper white setting, I would try and keep this as low as possible. The 80 value, again, is the place where darker end of the histogram typically looks right. You'll still notice that midtones and near black quickly increases in brightness more than they should if you go beyond this, and this is likely a byproduct of the filmic Tonemapper used in the game, which again, like some other titles I've looked at recently, maybe uses one of the tone mapping operators that kind of predates HDR10. Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, uses the 2006 Hable filmic Tonemapper, which was popularised by Uncharted 2 in 2009. Another filmic Tonemapper that's very commonly used is the Reinhardt Tonemapper. Now, as well as these being used to control the internal dynamic range of the game engine, the filmic Tonemapper is also designed to try and replicate the look of film stock, and this will have an effect on the saturation of colour and the overall tonal output of the image. Kind of think Instagram filters. Those are trying to recreate vintage retro film. I suspect there's still some tone mapping or grading in play that isn't really geared up for the different data layout of an HDR10 output. In the HDR game mode, we still notice that the game is much less saturated than in SDR, and I suspect that the tone mapper actually intentionally desaturates the image as it becomes darker, and the game is a little underexposed. Now, this desaturation is, by design, the typical behaviour of the Reinhardt Tonemapper, and it's quite clear to see, particularly at night time when the game looks far less blue in colour than in SDR. because the overall image is dimmer. The way that the game lands on your display is a complex interplay of lots of different systems. So the issues that we are seeing here with the desaturation and an image that is unusably dim outside of a light-controlled room may also be related to the game's auto-exposure or eye adaptation systems. As we walk into this interior, we can see that the exposure is increased and we can still see Arthur and this darker room. But now you can see that the outside is a lot brighter than it was, and as it's brightened up, it's actually become more saturated as a result. When we're inside the building here, this is one of the most profound changes that unlocking the peak brightness has, as we now have enough dynamic range to see the interior and the exterior simultaneously. But what you'll see is as we walk outside again, the game recognises the increased brightness of the outdoors and actually turns the exposure down, and it actually underexposes it a little bit, leaving us with this duller image that then the Tonemapper is actually possibly desaturating. We can actually offset this a little bit by increasing the paper white value, but ideally some of the internal settings for the auto exposure need to be tweaked a little bit to function better in HDR. And this is a fairly common problem. It's something that's a really big challenge for open world games, where the lighting can be hugely different depending on the time of day and the weather conditions. Crackdown 3 is a champion of actually solving this issue. Sumo Digital actually carefully controlled the exposure using the in-game clock, and they actually manually specified different exposure values depending on what time of day it was in game, and this ensured that everything that was meant to be visible was visible and looked really great too. They did everything they could do to make sure that the dynamic range remained as large as possible at all different times. And then this was also used in conjunction with a carefully tuned automatic eye adaptation system that allowed for other on-screen changes to take effect and adjust exposure also. In order to correctly adjust the paper white setting in Red Dead Redemption 2 and bring the image in line with the rest of HDR grading recommendations, we'd actually need to set this setting close to 1000 nits, which would actually have other repercussions.
Don't let those supplies.
So in summary, Rockstar have solved the primary complaint of the game being labelled as HDR by removing that luminance cap. This does mean that there's now a visible difference in the dynamic range and the peak luminance whilst traversing the amazing natural world of Red Dead Redemption 2. Some small tweaks are needed to address the way the auto exposure and the grading behaves, and the effect that this has on the saturation and the overall dimness that is still present. This does make the game really hard to play outside of ideal viewing environments. If you do get the opportunity to play the game in a really dark room, this new setup does look fantastic. The peak brightness still behaves as we expect it to, and it really helps the game to pop more in HDR mode. The paper white setting still comes with the caveats that it had originally. You need to adjust it to brighten the image, but in doing so you'll perhaps notice the shadow detail becoming a little bit less black and a little bit less dark, especially when we compare it to the SDR mode. So the game's really close to being a complete package from an HDR point of view, and hopefully we'll see further improvements as Rockstar have clearly been listening to the feedback. So this was Adam, Evil Boris, Fairclough for HDTV Test. Thanks for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, please support HDTV Test with a like and a subscribe, maybe even a share somewhere. Oh, and again, happy birthday to Lady Mary Wortley Montague.